The cold had come early to Dakota Territory that year, and the second week of October 1887 arrived with a hard white frost on the wagon ruts outside Farrell Kincaid's General Store in Kestrel Bend. The sky was that pale, washed blue a prairie autumn takes on just before the first real snow, and the smell of coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge. 2 doors down drifted across the rutted main street and mixed with the smell of cured leather and coffee beans and lamp oil from inside the store. Ottilie Engelbrecht tied her old bay mare, Frida, to the hitching rail, brushed a flake of dried mud from the hem of her brown wool skirt, and climbed the 3 worn plank steps to the porch. She was 27 years old that October, 5 years into her new country, 14 months into her widowhood, and she carried her mother-in-law's small beaded coin purse in the palm of her left hand, as if it were a prayer book. Her son Klaus, 7 years old, waited in the wagon with a strip of rabbit jerky and a wool blanket across his knees. He was not to come in. She had told him so twice on the drive. The bell above the door rang as she stepped inside, and Farrell Kincaid, the Irish proprietor, 52 and going soft around the middle, looked up from a ledger and gave her a nod that was neither warm nor unfriendly. He was a neutral man by nature, a man who had learned early in a frontier town that a storekeeper's opinions were best kept behind his teeth. Behind him, along the back wall, stood the glass jars of peppermint sticks and horehound drops, the bolts of calico, the tins of baking powder, the sacks of flour marked Minneapolis Mills in blue stenciled letters. And beside the counter, one boot hooked on the brass footrail, stood Orville Crittenden, the town banker, 55 years old, Cincinnati-born, wearing his usual dark broadcloth suit and a watch chain as thick as a child's finger. He was talking to no one in particular, as was his habit, holding forth about the price of winter wheat in Chicago. In the corner by the pickle barrel, Hedwig Bauerfeld, the miller's wife, 45 and pink-cheeked from the cold, pretended to examine a bolt of blue gingham, but was, in truth, listening to every word spoken in the store. Ottilie stepped to the counter and asked, in her careful, lightly accented English, for 1 pound of saltpeter. Farrell Kincaid nodded and turned toward the shelf where the brown paper twists of potassium nitrate sat next to the tins of boot black and the packets of sulfur matches. But before his hand reached the shelf, Orville Crittenden gave out a short, barking laugh that seemed to rattle the glass of the front window, and he turned to the 2 or 3 other customers and said, loud enough for the whole store and the porch and probably the hitching rail to hear, "Well, gentlemen, mark the hour. The widow Engelbrecht is feeding her boy gunpowder now." Hedwig Bauerfeld giggled behind her gloved hand. Farrell Kincaid's jaw tightened, but he did not look up. He weighed the saltpeter on the brass pan scale, folded it into a square of brown paper, tied it with string, and slid it across the counter. Ottilie paid him 70 cents in silver coin, thanked him, turned, and walked out. The bell rang once. The door closed behind her. She untied Frida, climbed up beside Klaus, tucked the brown paper packet beneath the wagon seat, and clicked her tongue. Frida leaned into the traces. The wagon rolled. They laughed that day. By the following September, every family in Kestrel Bend would stand at her cabin door, and more than one would kneel. To understand how Ottilie Engelbrecht came to be buying saltpeter on a cold October morning in a town that thought her foolish, one must go back 5 years to the spring of 1882, when a young couple from a small village in East Prussia boarded the steamer SS Hermann at the port of Bremen with 2 wooden trunks a tin of dried sausage, a Bible bound in black leather, and 87 American dollars sewn into the lining of a man's waistcoat. Ezekiel Engelbrecht was 24 then, broad-shouldered, quiet, with hands that had worked his father's stony 5-acre parcel since he was a boy. His bride, Ottilie, was 22, the youngest daughter of a farming family whose grandmother Brigitte had been the village's most respected keeper of smoked hams and hard sausages and crocked meats. Brigitte had taught Ottilie, from the age of 9, the old Prussian ways of curing: salt from the Baltic trade, saltpeter from the chemist's shop in the market town, brown sugar when it could be afforded, honey when it could not, the weekly turning of the meat, the cool stone cellar, the patience, the faith in method. The girl Ottilie had stood beside her grandmother at a glazed earthenware crock more than 100 times before she ever crossed an ocean. The Herman rolled for 14 days across the North Atlantic in weather that took the appetite from most of the steerage passengers and left them pale and thin on the dock at Castle Garden in New York Harbor. From there, the Engelbrechts rode railroads west, sitting upright on wooden benches through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois, eating sausage and hard rye bread and drinking watered coffee at station stops, until they came at last to the rolling grasslands of Dakota Territory, where the Homestead Act of 1862 still promised 160 acres to any man who would break the sod, build a dwelling, and live upon the land for 5 years. They filed their claim in the spring of 1883, 4 miles east of a shallow creek called the Kestrel Fork and the small town of Kestrel Bend that clung to its banks. They paid the $14 filing fee. They drove a wagon out across the tall grass to the section corner marked by a rough limestone boulder and a government surveyor's iron stake, and Ezekiel took off his hat and stood for a long minute looking at the sweep of empty prairie that was now theirs to tame. The first years were hard in the way all first years on the prairie were hard. Ezekiel broke 20 acres of virgin sod that first summer behind a borrowed walking plow and a team of mismatched oxen and the grasshopper tails of old root systems caught at the blade and snapped wooden beams twice. They lived that first winter in a dugout cut into the south face of a low hill with a stovepipe that smoked in any wind from the north, and Ottilie learned to bake sourdough biscuits over buffalo chips when the coal ran low. In the spring of 1884, they cut cottonwood and hauled it and hewed it and raised a proper cabin, 18 feet by 24. A single room with a sod and timber wall and a shingle roof and one real window of glass that Ezekiel had carried up from the railroad siding at Pierre, wrapped in a horse blanket. They added a lean-to for firewood on the north side. They dug a root cellar 20 feet from the cabin door into the south face of that same low hill, 8 feet wide by 12 feet long, stone and clay walls, clay floor packed hard with the heel of an axe, and wetted down and packed again, wooden shelving along both long walls, a heavy plank door with iron strap hinges and a wooden latch. The cellar held at 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, even through the worst of a Dakota July, because the hill above it was thick with prairie sod, and the door faced away from the afternoon sun. Klaus was born in the cabin in September of 1880, before the crossing. A small, dark-eyed boy with his father's slow patience and his mother's quick understanding. He was not yet 2 when they boarded the Herman. He was 5 when they finished the cabin. He was 6 on the cold, gray morning in August of 1886 when a borrowed roan named Bruno, a horse Ezekiel had taken on loan from a neighbor to help haul a broken-down wagon, shied at the sound of a falling bucket and kicked out with both hind hooves and caught Ezekiel square in the chest. Ezekiel walked the quarter-mile back to the cabin on his own feet and sat down heavily on the bench by the door and told Attili that his breath was shallow. Doc Abernathy McGrady of Kestrel Bend, 64 and Edinburgh trained, rode out the following morning and stayed 3 days. Ezekiel died on the 4th morning of a broken rib that had pierced the lining of his lung. He was buried on a rise above the root cellar under a cottonwood cross that Silas Quinn Weatherby, the town blacksmith, forged and set the iron fittings for without charge. Klaus was 6 years old. Attili was 26. The homestead had 2.5 years left to prove up for a patent from the land office. She stayed. 14 months passed. Attili plowed her own 10 acres that spring of 1887 behind Frida, the old bay mare, and planted winter wheat and a kitchen garden and 12 hills of potatoes and a patch of cabbages. Klaus carried water from the creek and fed the 3 laying hens and the 1 milk cow that had been Ezekiel's last purchase. They ate plainly. They paid their small debts in town. They were known in Kestrel Bend as the widow Engelbrecht and her quiet boy. And somewhere in Attilia's head, through all those 14 months, the shape of her grandmother Brigitte's cure waited like a sleeping thing. The salt, the saltpeter, the brown sugar, the crock, the cellar, the weekly turning. Her grandmother had used that cure through 40 Prussian winters. It had fed a village through famine in 1847. It had carried hams from November to August without a trace of spoilage. Attili did not doubt the method. She only waited for the meat to cure. The meat came to her on a gray afternoon in the last week of October 1887, on a wagon driven by an old man named Yancey Claymore. Yancey was 71 and had been one of the first white settlers to file a claim along the Kestrel Fork back in 1869. He had outlived 2 wives and buried 3 children and was now dying, slowly, of the consumption that had settled in his chest 2 winters before. He drove his wagon up to Attilia's cabin in a thin, cold rain, climbed down carefully, tipped his stained felt hat, and stood in the dooryard with his breath rattling. Behind his wagon, tied by short ropes to the tailgate, were 2 pigs, a rangy sow that would weigh out at 230 pounds and a younger barrow of perhaps 180. Yancey Claymore said, in his thin, reedy voice, that he was going to his son Caleb's house in Chicago before the snow. He could not winter alone, he said, and Caleb had written 3 times asking him to come. He said he had 6 pigs left in his pen, and he had already promised 4 of them to other neighbors. He said he had saved these 2 for her. He said Ezekiel had helped him birth both of their mothers 4 springs back, and had sat up through a night with a sick sow in his barn without taking a penny for it. Attili tried to pay him. She brought out the small beaded coin purse. Yancey Claymore shook his head. He said he did not want money from a widow. He said the pigs were a gift to her boy. He looked at Klaus, who was standing in the cabin doorway with a rag doll he had made from burlap and corncob, and his eyes filled, and he turned quickly so no one would see. He untied the 2 pigs and led them with their short ropes to the small rail pen that Ezekiel had built the autumn before his death, and he set them inside and dropped the gate pin and latched it. He took Attilia's hand for a moment in both of his own papery hands. He said, "God keep you, daughter." He climbed back onto his wagon with some difficulty. He tipped his hat once more. He drove off through the cold drizzle toward the west, toward the railroad at Pierre, toward the long train ride to Chicago and his son's spare bedroom, and Ottilie stood in the dooryard until the wagon was a dark speck on the horizon, and then she went into the cabin and sat down at the pine table and pressed both her hands against her eyes. She did not weep. She had not wept since the day she buried Ezekiel. But she sat for some long minutes, and Klaus climbed up on the bench beside her and leaned his head against her arm, and after a while she stood up and said they had work to do. They never saw Yancey Claymore again. He died of pneumonia in his son's parlor in Chicago on the 29th of January, 1888, and the word of it came to Kestrel Bend by letter in March. 2 pigs of that size would yield, after slaughter and butchering and the trimming of waste, approximately 240 pounds of usable pork. 240 pounds was enough to carry a small family through a year with care. 240 pounds was also, in a frontier town where spoiled meat killed people every summer, a terrible responsibility. Ottilie sat at her pine table that evening with a stub of pencil and a sheet of brown wrapping paper, and wrote out the proportions her grandmother had taught her. 2 pounds of coarse salt, 3 ounces of brown sugar, and 2 ounces of saltpeter per 100 pounds of pork. For 240 pounds, she would need 4 8/10 pounds of salt, 7 2/10 ounces of brown sugar, and 4 8/10 ounces of saltpeter. She had the salt. She had a small crock of brown sugar she had traded 3 dozen eggs for in August. She did not have the saltpeter. Saltpeter she would have to buy in town from Farrell Kincaid's general store, and for that she would have to hitch Frida to the wagon and drive 4 miles west on the wagon road and walk up the plank steps of the store and ask for it out loud in front of whoever happened to be in the store at the time. She went on the first Tuesday of November. The frost was hard. Klaus rode beside her in the wagon with his wool blanket. She tied Frida at the rail and climbed the steps. And that was the morning Orville Crittenden made his joke about gunpowder and Hedwig Bauerfeld giggled behind her gloved hand. Ottilie paid her 70 cents and walked out. But the joke did not stay in the store. Hedwig Bauerfeld was a woman who carried gossip the way a magpie carried bright things, compulsively, indiscriminately, and with obvious pleasure. Within 2 days she had told 3 other women in Kestrel Bend that the widow east of town was going to poison her boy with blasting powder. Within 4 days the story had grown. The widow was mixing gunpowder into the boy's supper to make him bigger. The widow was some kind of old-world witch who kept a black crock in her cellar and spoke Prussian incantations over it. The widow had gone strange since her husband's death and could not be trusted near children. By the end of the first week of November, the story had reached the one-room schoolhouse at the west end of Kestrel Bend, where the schoolteacher, Prudence Danforth Willoughby, 30 years old and New England raised and earnest to the bone, heard it in a lunch-hour conversation between 2 older girls and felt a cold finger of concern run down her spine. Prudence Danforth Willoughby was not an unkind woman. She was a woman who believed that a schoolteacher had a responsibility to her pupils that extended past the schoolroom door, and so, on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, she kept Klaus Engelbrecht after the bell for a gentle conversation. She asked him, in her careful New England way, whether he was being fed anything unusual at home. She asked whether his mother gave him any medicine or powder. She asked whether his food ever tasted strange. Klaus Engelbrecht, 7 years old, sat on the wooden bench with his boots swinging a foot above the plank floor and looked at her with his father's slow, dark eyes, and he said, "Mama cooks good." He said it twice. He said his mother made a good rabbit stew and good sourdough biscuits, and that she had baked him a ginger cake on his last birthday. Prudence Danforth Willoughby felt the cold finger of concern thaw somewhat, and she sent the boy home with his lunch pail, and she resolved to keep an eye on him for the winter. She did not yet know that by May she would be the one fighting for her life. The story reached Silas Quinn Weatherby at his forge on a cold morning in the second week of November. He was hammering out a set of wagon hinges when the widow Addlestone, a thin woman with a mouth like a pulled thread, came in to collect a repaired pot handle and told him, with evident relish, that the widow Engelbrecht out east was poisoning her son with gunpowder. Silas Quinn Weatherby was 48 years old, Scots-Irish, the son of a Belfast blacksmith who had come across in 1845, and he had lost his own wife Nell to typhus in the same summer the Engelbrechts had arrived in Dakota Territory. He knew what a widow looked like from the inside. He also knew, because his own mother had come from a village in County Antrim, where saltpeter cures were as common as bread, that potassium nitrate was not gunpowder, and that it had kept hams sweet in cool stone pantries for 300 years. He did not say any of this to the widow Addlestone. He thanked her for her trade, took her coin, set down his hammer, and watched her go. His jaw was set hard. When she was out of the shop, he spat once into the coal bucket and muttered something his mother would have called unladylike. He decided that Sunday, if the weather held, he would ride east and see if the widow needed help with her butchering. November broke cold and clear, and on the first Sunday, Silas Quinn Weatherby rode out to the Engelbrecht homestead with a heavy iron butchering knife, a block and tackle system of his own forging, a length of good hemp rope, and a square of oilcloth wrapped around a chunk of bread and cheese that his housekeeper Mrs. Dearborn had packed for him without being asked. He arrived at mid-morning. Ottilie met him at the door with a look that was neither surprised nor unwelcoming. She said she could not pay him. He said he had not come for pay. He said he had come because Ezekiel had once shod his best mule without charging him, and because his own mother had cured pork with saltpeter in a stone crock every November for 40 years, and because any fool who called it gunpowder was a fool. Ottilie looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once and stepped aside and let him in. They slaughtered the barrow first, because he was the smaller and the easier to handle. Silas rigged the block and tackle from the crossbeam of the lean-to. They led the barrow out of the pen. Silas used the heavy iron knife with the quick, clean competence of a man who had done this work since he was 10. The barrow dropped. They hoisted him up by the hind legs. They bled him into a wooden tub that Ottilie had scrubbed with lye the day before. They scalded the carcass in a great iron kettle of water that had been set over a bed of coals since before dawn. They scraped the bristles with flat iron scrapers. They gutted and split the carcass and let it hang in the cold November air to cool. Then they did the sow, who was larger and took more effort, and by the time they had her bled and scalded and scraped and gutted and hanging beside the barrow in the lean-to, the sun was setting red over the western grasslands, and the temperature was already dropping toward the low 20s. The two carcasses would cool through the night in the open lean-to at temperatures that would not climb above freezing, which was precisely what one wanted for firming up pork before the cutting. The cutting began at first light on Monday. Silas Quinn Weatherby had ridden home Sunday evening and returned at dawn Monday. Klaus, allowed to watch now, sat on an upturned bucket by the lean-to door with his eyes wide. Ottilie worked with a smaller boning knife that had been her grandmother's and was honed to a blue edge. She cut the carcasses into the classic pieces of a farmhouse butchering. The hams from the hind legs, heavy and rounded, each one weighing between 15 and 20 pounds. The shoulders from the front legs, boxier and tougher, 8 to 12 pounds each. The bellies for bacon, long flat slabs marbled with lean and fat, perhaps 10 to 14 pounds each. The sides of salt pork from the back ribs and flanks. The loins she set aside for fresh eating through the first weeks of winter, wrapped in clean linen and carried straight to the root cellar. She saved the fat for rendering into lard. She saved the trimmings for sausage. She saved the feet for pickling, and the jowls for bacon, and the hocks for smoking later, and the bones for broth. Nothing of the 2 pigs was wasted. Her grandmother Brigitte would have expected no less. When the hams and shoulders and bellies and sides were cut and laid out on the clean pine boards, Ottilie had scrubbed that morning with lye and rinsed with boiling water and dried in the sun. She went to the kitchen and measured out the cure. She weighed 4 pounds and 12 ounces of coarse salt, which she had bought in a 20-pound sack from Farrell Kincaid in September for $1.50 on a small brass balance that had belonged to her grandmother. She measured 7 2/10 ounces of brown sugar from the small crock. She measured 4 8/10 ounces of saltpeter from the brown paper twist she had bought on the morning Orville Crittenden had laughed at her. She mixed the 3 together in a large wooden bowl, stirring with her clean hand until the cure was evenly blended, a coarse gray-white mixture flecked with brown and glinting faintly where the saltpeter crystals caught the lamplight. She explained the method to Silas as she worked, not because he needed to know, but because her grandmother had always said that speaking the method aloud made it hold. The salt, she said, would draw the moisture from the meat, and a piece of pork in a high-salt environment would not grow the bacteria that make meat turn. The saltpeter, the potassium nitrate, would do 2 things. It would fix the color of the meat to a clean pink rather than letting it turn the gray-brown of old pork. And, more importantly, when the saltpeter reacted with the natural lactic acid in the meat, it would form nitric oxide, a compound that would inhibit the most dangerous bacteria of all, Clostridium botulinum and its cousins, that cause the kind of food poisoning that kills a grown man in 36 hours. The brown sugar, she said, was for the friendly bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria that live in the meat naturally, to feed upon and to thrive and to outcompete the harmful ones. The cool cellar, at 40 to 45 degrees, would slow all the biological action down to a pace at which the cure could work its way into the meat evenly, over weeks, without spoilage ever getting a foothold. Silas listened without interrupting. His mother had told him some of this, but not all. He had not known about the nitric oxide. He filed the knowledge away. They packed the crock. The crock was a 15-gallon, cream-colored, salt-glazed stoneware piece from the Bristol potteries of Illinois, with a cobalt-blue hand-painted flourish around the shoulder. And Ottilie had bought it second-hand from a settler leaving the country in the autumn of 1884 for the sum of $1.75. It had a wooden lid that fit flush inside the mouth of the crock, and the lid was weighted with a flat river stone the size of a dinner plate that Ezekiel had carried up from the Kestrel Fork the same week they bought the crock. Ottilie rubbed each piece of pork thoroughly with the cure mixture, working it into every crease and fold and cut surface with the flat of her hand, making sure no square inch of flesh was left untouched. She laid the first ham flesh down in the bottom of the crock. She sprinkled additional cure over it. She laid the second ham beside it. More cure. Then the shoulders, packed in close around the hams. More cure. Then the bellies, rolled slightly to fit. Then the sides of salt pork, cut into manageable lengths. More cure between each layer. The crock filled slowly and heavily. By the time the last piece was tucked in and the last handful of cure was scattered across the top, the crock weighed nearly 200 pounds and was so heavy that neither of them could lift it alone. Together, using a wooden pallet and 2 stout oak poles that Silas had brought from his wagon, they carried the crock out of the cabin and across the 20 feet to the root cellar door. They maneuvered it down the 3 packed earth steps. They settled it on the clay floor in the coolest corner against the north wall, where the temperature held steadiest. Ottilie placed the wooden disc on top of the packed meat. She set the flat river stone on top of the disc. The stone pressed the disc down, and the disc pressed the meat down, and the cure, drawn out of the meat by the salt, would rise around everything and cover every surface with a brine that was too salty and too alkaline and too hostile for any spoilage organism to survive in. Silas Quinn Weatherby stood looking at the crock in the dim cellar light, his breath making a small, pale cloud in the cold air. He said quietly, "Your grandmother's method?" Ottilie nodded. Silas said, "Then it is sound." He climbed back up the steps, closed the cellar door, dropped the wooden latch. He ate a plate of bread and cheese at her table. He refused her offer of the loin for his trouble. He rode home at dusk through a thin falling snow. He did not come back for 6 weeks. If you're finding this story settling into you the way a good story should, the way the cure was settling into that pork there in the cellar, take a moment to let the channel know with a thumbs up and a comment. It tells the algorithm that stories like this, slow and grounded and true to the frontier, are worth telling. And now back to the cabin and the long Dakota winter that was already on its way. December came down hard on the prairie the second week of the month. A blizzard blew for 2.5 days out of the northwest, and when it cleared, the drifts stood 4 feet deep against the north wall of the cabin, and the cattle tanks were frozen solid, a handspan down. Ottilie broke the ice every morning with a wooden maul. She fed Frida and the milk cow from the haymow. She carried firewood into the cabin in armloads until the lean-to was half empty, and she had to saw more from the cottonwood stack by the creek. She read to Klaus at night from the black leather Bible and from a battered copy of a German children's storybook her mother had pressed into her hands at the dock in Bremen. They ate simply, sourdough biscuits and beans and gravy and fresh pork loin for the first few weeks, until the loin was gone. They ate potatoes from the root cellar, carrots packed in sand, onions strung from the rafters, dried apples. Once a week, on Sunday, after morning prayers, Ottilie took a lantern and the wooden maul and went out to the root cellar and opened the crock. She lifted the stone and the wooden disc, and she turned each piece of meat so that the top became the bottom, and the bottom became the top, and the brine could circulate evenly through every inch of flesh. The crock smelled of salt and a faint sweetness and a cool mineral note that her grandmother had once said was the smell of the saltpeter working. There was no hint of sour, no hint of off, no hint of the sharp ammoniacal smell that meant a cure had failed. She turned the meat 6 times in 6 weeks, and then, on the Sunday after Christmas, she left the stone on and closed the cellar door, and did not open it again for a month. At Christmas itself, she pulled a half side of bacon from the crock, rinsed the cure off in cold water from a pitcher, patted it dry with a linen cloth and hung it in the cold chimney corner for a day to set the surface. Then she sliced a portion thick and fried it in her cast-iron skillet with 3 eggs from her hens, and she and Klaus ate Christmas breakfast with their elbows on the pine table and the stove ticking beside them. The bacon was pink and firm and slightly sweet from the brown sugar and slightly salty, and the rind crisped up golden brown. Klaus ate 4 slices. He asked for a 5th. She gave it to him. She sang a Prussian Christmas carol in a low voice as she washed the skillet afterward. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, the carol her grandmother had sung at the old Crock in the stone pantry in East Prussia 30 years before, when Ottilie was a small girl standing at her elbow. January came bitter, 40 below on 3 nights. The cabin was warm because Ottilie had banked the stove high and because Ezekiel had caulked every seam of the cabin walls with a mixture of mud and horsehair the summer he built it. Klaus grew an inch. His cheeks filled out. The shadow of grief that had lived behind his eyes since his father's death began to lift. In February, a false thaw came through. A 5-day run of warm southerly air that turned the snow to slush and then froze it again. And Ottilie pulled a shoulder from the crock and made a thick bean and pork stew that lasted 4 days. In March, the real thaw came, and the creek ran high, and the prairie greened in patches, and the meadowlarks returned. At Easter, the 2nd Sunday of April, Ottilie pulled a ham from the crock, the smallest of the 4 hams, perhaps 14 pounds, and she baked it slow in the Dutch oven with a glaze of the last of the brown sugar and a handful of dried apples. And she and Klaus walked the 4 miles to the little wooden Lutheran church at the edge of Kestrel Bend for the Easter service, and they came home and ate the ham with boiled potatoes and the first tender spears of wild asparagus from the creek bank. The ham was perfect, pink, firm, deeply flavored, with the faint floral note of the saltpeter cured meat her grandmother had always turned out of her Prussian crock. Klaus said it was the best ham he had ever eaten. He did not know that he had just eaten pork that had been curing for 5 months. Through all those months, the rest of Kestrel Bend was fine because winter was winter. Every family kept meat. Smokehouses hung hams and bacon and hard sausages over slow-burning hickory and corncob fires. Spring houses and shallow cellars held the cold-packed pork, buried in straw and rock salt. The temperatures outdoors stayed low enough through March that the occasional warm day did no harm. The town forgot, for the most part, about the widow east of town and her foreign crock. Orville Crittenden went about his banking. Hedwig Bauerfeld found fresher gossip. Prudence Danforth Willoughby taught her spelling lessons. Farrell Kincaid sold sacks of flour and tins of baking powder. Silas Quinn Weatherby hammered out horseshoes at his forge. The Piper family, 4 miles south of the Engelbrecht place, struggled along as they always did. Ephraim Piper was a thin, gaunt man who had never quite figured out how to prosper on the prairie, and his wife Constance bore up as best she could, and their 4 children ran barefoot in the dooryard. Their cellar was a shallow thing, dug hastily in 1885, and it climbed warmer in hot weather than a cellar ought to. But nobody knew, that early, that the summer of 1888 would be the summer that tested every cellar in the county to its limits. April came, and Dakota weather did what Dakota weather sometimes does, which is to say, it flipped like a switch. The first 2 weeks of the month were cool and gray and reasonable, with nighttime lows in the 30s and daytime highs in the 50s. Then on the 14th of April, a Saturday, a great mass of warm southerly air rolled up out of Kansas, and the temperature in Kestrel Bend climbed to 80 degrees by 2 in the afternoon. It held there for 3 days. On the 17th, it dropped back to 65, and a thunderstorm came through and dumped 1.5 inches of rain in 4 hours. By the 20th, it was back up to 78. The prairie greened overnight. The creek flooded. The wild plum trees bloomed 2 weeks early, and in root cellars and spring houses all across the county, the thermometer began to creep upward from the 35 degrees that had been comfortable in March to 40, to 45, to 50, and in the shallow cellars and poorly sighted ones, to 55 and even 60. 55 degrees is not a safe temperature for uncured pork. Pork held in straw-packed barrels at 55 degrees for more than a few days will begin to grow spoilage bacteria, lactic acid bacteria at first, which only sour the meat. But then, as the surface moisture rises and the oxygen reaches into the pack, the more dangerous organisms, the Staphylococcus and the Salmonella, and, in rare and terrible cases, the Clostridium botulinum. The Hendricks family, 8 miles west of town, had their smokehouse burned down on the 19th of April in a grass fire that also took their haystack and their chicken coop. They salvaged what meat they could from the half-burned smokehouse, and they cold-packed it in a hastily dug pit lined with straw. By the first week of May, the salvaged meat had begun to sour. 2 other families, the Obermans and the Lindstroms, lost the last of their winter cold-pack pork the second week of May to spoilage that showed as a greenish surface slime and a smell that one could not mistake for anything but rot. They buried the spoiled pork in a pit and went without. Ottilie Engelbrecht's root cellar dug deep into the south face of the low hill, with 2 feet of prairie sod over it, and a heavy insulated door held at 42 degrees through the April heat, and at 44 degrees through the early May warm spell. The crock sat undisturbed. The brine inside was clear and heavy with salt. The pork beneath the brine was pink and firm and sweet. Ottilie knew it was holding because she could smell it through the slight crack where the wooden lid met the stoneware. A clean, faintly floral, cool mineral smell that was, if anything, better than it had been in March. On the morning of the 8th of May, 1888, a Tuesday, Prudence Danforth Willoughby rose at 6 o'clock in her second-floor room at Millicent Hartridge's boarding house on Prairie Street in Kestrel Bend, washed at the porcelain basin, pinned up her chestnut hair, put on her gray wool teaching dress, and came downstairs to the dining room for breakfast. Millicent Hartridge, 58, proud, stubborn, and a woman who did not believe that any meat from her own cellar could possibly be bad, served her 3 strips of thick-sliced bacon, 2 fried eggs, a biscuit with butter, and a cup of coffee. The bacon was from a slab that had been cold-packed in the cellar since the previous November. It was 6 weeks past what even Millicent Hartridge, in her more honest moments, would have called a safe eating date. The cellar had crept up to 58 degrees during the April warm spell. The bacon had begun to sour 3 weeks before, and Millicent Hartridge had rinsed the worst of the sliminess off under cold water and pronounced it fine. Prudence Danforth Willoughby ate the bacon and the eggs. She drank the coffee. She walked the 4 blocks to the schoolhouse. She unlocked the door, rang the bell, greeted her 19 pupils. By 9 o'clock, she felt hot and strange, and her stomach was cramping hard. By 9:30, she was sweating through the back of her gray dress. By 10 o'clock, she had staggered to the door of the schoolhouse, bent double, and vomited into the dust of the yard. By 10:15, she had collapsed in the doorway, unable to rise. The oldest pupil, a 12-year-old boy named Harlan Greer, ran 3 blocks for Doc Abernathy McGrady and another 2 for the minister. Doc McGrady came on foot with his black leather bag, 64 years old and white-bearded and still quick on his feet, and he knelt beside her and took her pulse and felt her forehead and said, in his careful Edinburgh accent, "Staphylococcal food poisoning, and a bad one. What did she eat this morning?" They carried her back to the boarding house on a plank. She ran a fever of 104 degrees that afternoon. She vomited through the afternoon and the night. Doc McGrady gave her paregoric and ordered cold compresses. By Wednesday evening, 2 of the Hartridge children, who had also eaten of the same bacon at supper the night before, were sick as well. Not as badly as Prudence, but badly enough. Millicent Hartridge, pale and shaken, finally admitted to Doc McGrady that the bacon had been, perhaps, a little past its date. Doc McGrady said, in a voice that was not kind, that it had been a great deal past its date, and that she was lucky she had not killed her boarder. Prudence Danforth Willoughby lay in bed through the rest of that week, unable to take anything but broth and weak tea, and did not return to the schoolhouse until the following Tuesday. A full week of her strength gone, and her face thinner by 5 pounds, and her heart marked in some deep place by the knowledge of how close she had come to dying from a breakfast. The town began to connect dots. June came, and with June came the real heat. The first week of June ran in the mid-80s. The second week touched 90. By the third week of June, the thermometer on the wall of Farrell Kincaid's general store read 92 at 3 in the afternoon, 3 days running. The wind came from the south, and it came hot and dry, and it sucked the moisture out of the prairie grass and turned it from green to gold in 10 days. The creek shrank back to a trickle at its midsummer low. Dust rose behind every wagon, and in every shallow cellar and every poorly insulated spring house in the county, the temperature climbed toward 65 and, in the worst cases, 70. Meat that had been sound in April was sour by the second week of June. Meat that had been sour in May was dangerous by the last week of June. Families that had always cold-packed their pork without trouble suddenly had nothing that could safely be eaten. Families that had smoked their hams and bacon over hickory, which was the real protection against warm-weather spoilage, because the creosote and the dehydration of smoking killed the bacteria on the surface and sealed the interior. Those families were better off, but even some of those found that hams not smoked heavily enough or hung in poorly ventilated smokehouses were beginning to develop a dark, rancid rim under the bark. The Piper family had no smokehouse. Ephraim Piper, 40 years old and gaunt from a decade of hard years, had never built one. He had told his wife Constance every winter that he would build one in the spring, and every spring something had broken or failed, and the smokehouse had not been built. They cold-packed their pork in wooden barrels in a shallow cellar, dug into a bit of high ground behind their cabin. The cellar had never been a good one. It climbed to 60 degrees on warm April afternoons. In June of 1888, it climbed to 65. By the 10th of June, their last barrel of salt pork had turned, not just sour, but actively rotten, the surface crawling with greenish slime, the smell so strong that Constance Piper gagged and could not stand at the cellar door. They buried the contents of the barrel behind the cabin. They had nothing else. Ephraim Piper walked the 4 miles into Kestrel Bend on the morning of the 11th of June with his hat in his hands and went to Farrell Kincaid's general store and asked, in a low voice, whether he might have a sack of flour and a tin of lard on credit. Farrell Kincaid, who was a harder man at the counter than he looked, had nevertheless known Ephraim Piper for 6 years and knew that he was a decent man in a hard spot, and he gave him a 20-pound sack of flour and a 4-pound tin of lard on a handshake and a note of credit for $1.80. Ephraim Piper walked home with the sack over his shoulder. Constance Piper made biscuits and gravy that night with the lard and the flour and a small cup of milk from their 1 cow. The 4 Piper children ate the biscuits hungrily. The youngest, a 9-month-old infant named Jonah, would not nurse properly because Constance's milk had thinned from hunger. The baby was listless and ran a low fever that night. Ephraim Piper sat on the bench by the cabin door in the hot June dusk and looked at the dry prairie stretching north toward the Engelbrecht homestead 4 miles away, and he did not yet know that in 3 weeks' time he would walk that 4 miles with his hat in his hands a second time, to a door he did not yet know could open for him. On the 6th of June, a Wednesday, 6 months and 1 week after she had packed the crock, Ottilie Engelbrecht went down into the root cellar with her lantern and her wooden maul, and she approached the crock with some small care. She had not opened it since the end of February. She wanted to see whether the cure had taken as her grandmother's cures had always taken. She set the lantern on the top shelf. She knelt on the clay floor. She lifted the flat river stone. She set it aside. She lifted the wooden disc. She lifted out a side of bacon, one of the shorter pieces, perhaps 8 pounds, and she held it in the lantern light. The surface was slick with the heavy brine. She wiped it with a clean linen cloth. The meat beneath was pink, a deep, settled pink, not the raw red of fresh pork, but the cured pink of proper bacon, and the fat was cream white and firm. She held the piece to her nose. The smell was clean, faintly salty, a cool mineral note, a floral sweetness from the brown sugar and the saltpeter. It was, in every particular, the smell her grandmother's cellar in East Prussia had carried through 40 summers. She carried the side of bacon up to the cabin. She set it on the pine table. She trimmed a thin sliver from the lean end with her boning knife. She dropped the sliver into a cast-iron skillet with a small spoonful of her own rendered lard. The skillet was already hot on the stove. The sliver sizzled. The smell that rose off it was the smell of bacon frying, but something deeper, richer, more complete. The smell of a cure that had had 6 months to reach the center of the meat and settle. Klaus, who had been reading at the window, came running. He stood at the stove. She fried 6 more slices. He ate 3 standing at the stove, barefoot, with bacon grease on his chin. She ate 2. She set the last one aside to cool. She sat down at the pine table and she did something she had not done since Ezekiel's funeral. She put her face in her hands and she wept, quietly, without drama, the tears running down between her fingers. She wept for her grandmother. She wept for Ezekiel. She wept for the 2.5 years of widowhood. She wept, most of all, for the moment of knowing that the method had held, that the pork was sound, that her boy would eat clean meat through a Dakota summer that was already beginning to kill other families' stores. Klaus, watching from the stove, came and put his arms around her neck. He said, "Mama, it is good bacon." She laughed through the tears. She said, "Yes, it is good bacon." Silas Quinn Weatherby rode out to the Engelbrecht place on the 18th of June, a Monday, to check on the widow and the boy, as he had privately resolved to do once a month through the summer. He arrived at mid-morning. Ottilie met him at the door. She invited him in. She put a cast-iron skillet on the stove. She fried 6 slices of the cured bacon. She set a plate before him. He took one bite. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He took another bite. He looked up at her. He said, "Mrs. Engelbrecht, this is the best bacon I have eaten since I left my mother's kitchen in 1856. He said it without exaggeration. He ate the whole plate. He ate a second plate. He drank 3 cups of coffee. When he was done, he sat for a long time with his hands flat on the pine table, and he said, "The Pipers have nothing. Their cellar failed. The baby is sick." Ottilie asked how much they needed. Silas said, "Some, not too much, enough to get them through until the harvest comes in." Ottilie nodded. Silas rode home. He did not speak of what he had seen in the cellar or of the taste of the bacon to anyone but Ephraim Piper himself, whom he found the next day mending a harness in the dooryard, and to whom he said, quietly, "Go see the widow Engelbrecht. She has meat. She is a fair woman. Take your hat off." Ephraim Piper walked the 4 miles north on the 20th of June in the hot morning. He had not eaten a slice of meat in 11 days. Constance Piper had given the last of the milk to the baby. He walked with his hat in his hands. He arrived at the Engelbrecht cabin. Ottilie was at the clothesline hanging out a basket of washing. She saw him come up the wagon track. She watched him come. She knew before he spoke what he was going to ask. He stopped 10 feet from her. He said, "Ma'am, I am Ephraim Piper, from South. My cellar failed. My baby is sick. Silas Quinn Weatherby told me to come. I can pay some, not all. I can pay in credit and finish at harvest." Ottilie Engelbrecht set down the wet linen shirt she had been hanging. She said, "Come in, Mr. Piper." She walked him to the root cellar. She showed him the crock. She drew out a ham of about 12 pounds and a side of bacon of about 8 pounds and a shoulder of about 7 pounds, 27 pounds of cured pork in all. She quoted him the market price, 20 cents a pound for the ham, 18 cents a pound for the bacon, 17 cents a pound for the shoulder. The total came to $5.23. She said he could pay $2 now and the rest at harvest with no interest. He said he had $1.60 on him. She said that would do for the first payment. She wrapped the meat in clean linen. She packed it into a flour sack he had brought. She handed it to him. He took it in both hands. He did not cry at her door. Ephraim Piper was a proud man, but his mouth worked and he could not speak for some moments, and when he could speak, he said, "Ma'am, thank you, my wife." He could not finish the sentence. Ottilie nodded. She said, "Go home, Mr. Piper, feed your baby." He walked the 4 miles back. Constance Piper made a broth from the shoulder bone and some potatoes and a handful of wild onions, and she fed the broth to the baby with a small tin spoon. And by the next morning, the baby was nursing again, because Constance's milk had come in with the good food, and within 3 days, the fever was gone. Word moves through a prairie town the way grass fire moves through a dry meadow. By the 22nd of June, Kestrel Ben knew that the Piper family had walked home from the Engelbrecht place with a sack of sweet cured pork. By the 24th, Kestrel Ben knew that Prudence Danforth Willoughby, recovered now from her bout of food poisoning and teaching again, had told her landlady Millicent Hartridge in a sharp private conversation that the widow east of town apparently knew more about preserving meat than anyone in Kestrel Bend. By the 26th, Hedwig Bauerfeld had heard the story at the mill from 3 separate customers and had gone home and sat at her kitchen table in a state of what, for a woman of Hedwig Bauerfeld's self-regard, almost passed for remorse. On the 28th of June, a Thursday, Hedwig Bauerfeld rose at dawn, put on her best Sunday dress, put up her hair under her best bonnet, packed a tin of last summer's strawberry preserves into a linen-lined basket, walked to the livery, hired a wagon and a boy to drive it, and rode the 4 miles out to the Engelbrecht homestead on a hot, dusty morning. She arrived at 10 o'clock. Ottilie was in the garden weeding between rows of cabbages. Hedwig Bauerfeld climbed down from the wagon. She approached the garden fence. She said, "Mrs. Engelbrecht." Her voice was thinner than usual. Ottilie stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came to the fence. Hedwig Bauerfeld held out the tin of preserves. She said, "I heard you have pork to sell. I would like to buy some. I brought this." Ottilie looked at her for a long moment. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She took the tin. She said, "Come." She led Hedwig to the root cellar. She sold her 8 pounds of bacon at 18 cents a pound, and she charged her $1.44 in coin, and she did not offer her credit, and she did not mention the morning at Farrell Kincaid's store in October, or the giggle behind the gloved hand. Hedwig Bauerfeld paid. She took the bacon. She said, "Mrs. Engelbrecht, I was a fool that day." Ottilie Engelbrecht said, in her lightly accented English, "Yes, you were." She said it without heat, without cruelty, simply as a statement of fact. Hedwig Bauerfeld climbed back into the wagon. She rode home. She did not, so far as anyone knew, spread another cruel word about another settler's household for the remainder of her life. Through the first 3 weeks of July, the heat held. The Obermanns came. The Lindstroms came. A family named Fulcher came. A family named Radigan came. Ottilie sold pork to each of them at market price. She took coin where she could. She took credit where she could not. She kept a careful ledger in a small black-bound book at the pine table, writing each family's name and the weight and the price and the balance owed in her clean copper plate. She did not overcharge. She did not underfeed her own household. She turned Klaus out to the garden every morning and to the creek every evening, and he ate well, and he slept deep, and he tanned brown as a hazelnut. She made the ledger balance against her own needs carefully. She did not want to run out of pork before September. She did not want to fail any family that came to her door. On the 24th of July, 1888, a Tuesday, a black buggy with a pair of matched bays pulled up the wagon track to the Engelbrecht cabin at 11 in the morning. Orville Crittenden stepped down. He was 55 years old, his gray hair pomaded flat, his linen suit already damp at the armpits, his silk cravat pulled too tight at his sunburned throat. His black bowler hat sat on his head at a slight angle that suggested he had set it there with difficulty. His face was flushed. His lips were pressed thin. Behind him, standing in the buggy with the reins in her hand, was his housekeeper, Mrs. Voss, a stout woman of 60 with a mouth like a pursed seam. Orville Crittenden walked across the dooryard. Ottilie came to the door. Klaus watched from the cabin window. Orville Crittenden took off his bowler. He said, in a voice considerably smaller than the voice he had used in Farrell Kincaid's store 9 months before, "Mrs. Engelbrecht, I am given to understand that you have cured pork for sale." Ottilie said. "I do." She did not invite him in. She did not smile. She stood in the doorway in her faded brown work dress with a streak of flour across the apron from the morning's baking. Orville Crittenden said his own larder had failed. He said Mrs. Voss had purchased what was represented as fresh pork from a neighbor, and that it had turned within a day. He said he and his wife had been ill for 2 days. He said he required 8 pounds. Ottilie nodded. She walked him to the root cellar. She weighed out 8 pounds of bacon. She quoted him 20 cents a pound, 2 cents above her usual 18, because the bacon she had left was from the heart of the crock and was the best of the best. The total came to $1.60. Orville Crittenden paid her in coin. He did not look at her. He did not apologize. But when he climbed back into the buggy and settled his bowler on his head and lifted the reins to gather them, he paused, and he tipped the hat to her once. His eyes did not meet hers. He clicked his tongue. Mrs. Voss drove the bays down the track. They did not look back. Klaus, standing at the window, watched the buggy disappear down the wagon track toward the west. He came to his mother. He said, "Mama, that was the mean man from the store." Ottilie said, "Yes." Klaus said, "He gave you money." Ottilie said, "He did." Klaus said, "Are you happy?" Ottilie thought for a moment. She said, "I am content. It is not the same thing." Klaus did not quite understand, but he nodded because he trusted his mother's answers on matters he did not understand. The last pound of cured pork was lifted from the stoneware crock on the 9th of September, 1888, 9 months, 11 days after Ottilie and Silas had packed the crock in the cool November dusk. The crock had held 240 pounds of pork through a Dakota summer that had broken, by Ottilie's own quiet tally in her black-bound ledger, 7 cellars and 1 smokehouse, and had poisoned 3 townspeople and had killed the infant child of a family east of Kestrel Bend, who had never come to her door because they did not know she could help. Every ounce of the 240 pounds had been sound. Every ounce had been sweet. She had fed her son Klaus through the summer on the best cured pork he would ever eat. She had fed the Piper family enough to carry them to harvest, which came in good that August, and Ephraim Piper paid off his balance of $3.63 in coin and a jar of wild plum jelly his wife had put up. She had fed 3 other struggling homesteads, the Obermans, the Lindstroms, the Radigans. She had fed Hedwig Bauerfeld, who paid in coin and in a small weathered apology. She had fed Orville Crittenden, who paid in coin and in a silent tipped hat. She had fed, at Silas Quinn Weatherby's own request, and at fair price, Silas himself, who had cured his own pork badly in the past and now knew better. Her grandmother Brigitte Engelbrecht, dead now 12 years in a small village churchyard in East Prussia, had paid Ottilie's passage across an ocean and a decade of widowhood and the hardest Dakota summer in a generation, paid it in the form of a method whispered to a granddaughter at a crock in a cool stone pantry. The method had held. On the evening of the 9th of September, with the last empty crock standing beside her on the clay floor of the root cellar, and the prairie golden in the long slanting dusk beyond the open cellar door, Ottilie Engelbrecht stood with one hand resting on the cool stoneware shoulder where the cobalt blue flourish ran around the rim. Klaus was asleep in the cabin, curled on the rope bed under a patchwork quilt his mother had sewn from her own old dresses and his father's old Sunday shirt. The cicadas were loud in the grass. A hawk cut a slow circle against the red western sky. The air smelled of cut hay from the field Silas Quinn Weatherby had scythed for her the week before in return for nothing at all. Ottilie Engelbrecht stood there a long time. She said her grandmother's name aloud once. She said, "Brigitte." The prairie did not answer. It did not need to. If your grandmother's method carried you through a hard season, if there is a woman in your past whose patience and care and careful hands put food on a table long after she was gone, tell her name in the comments below. Her work outlived her. Her name deserves to.